items in the pouch in front of you.
Have a safe and informative journey.
Hello, I'm Nathan Hartman, and this is Dreamfinders, a podcast about the creative culture of Disney theme parks. Our guest this episode has charmed thousands of people throughout his career in theme park entertainment as both a performer and a writer. His talents have taken him to Disneyland, Magic Mountain, Universal Studios, the Magic Kingdom, and of course Epcot Center as a very special caretaker to a little purple dragon. Today's guest is the Dreamfinder himself, Ron Schneider. We talk about how he attended the very first day of operations at Disneyland, why legend Wally Boag was his one little spark of inspiration to get into acting, the time he spent managing the likes of the Marx Brothers and Laurel and Hardy over at Universal, and what the future looks like for theme park performance today. All of that and more is coming right up on Dreamfinders. Ron Schneider, it's more than appropriate for you to be on Dreamfinders. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Nathan. Thank you.
So, Ron, your connection to the Disney park starts long before you spent time working at one yourself, and it's beautifully tied into history. So, before we kind of get into present-day stuff and some other of your other work, tell us a little bit about your first experience going to Disneyland. Not only your first, but Minnie's.
Well, I was there the day the park opened to the public, July 18th, 1955. My father had done some of the air conditioning work in the park, and so we had passes to that first day. And my mother, grandmother, my father, and I were at the park. Don't have many memories of it, except for one memory that came to me years later. We had lunch at the Golden Horseshoe Saloon in Frontierland. We were seated towards the back, and I remember the lunch, but I don't remember watching the show. The reason this memory came back to me is that 25 years later, to the day, I was in the show in the Golden Horseshoe Review. I'd always been fascinated with Disneyland as a child. In the 1960s, there was this big revolution with the coming of audio animatronics and the influence of the New York World's Fair attractions. And there was kind of a revolution in the Disney theme parks, which fascinated me. And that, coupled with my interest in theater and magic and puppetry, kind of got me hooked on Disneyland's history and operations as a hobby. I read everything I could find about Walt Disney, and it became something that I was very interested in being a part of since there had been this big technological revolution in the 60s. I wanted to be a part of a live performance revolution, something that we're seeing now, that we're living through now with the way that the whole industry is going now. We're starting to focus more on the live performance aspects of it. So growing up going to Disneyland and watching the park evolve has been a constant fascination.
And you speak about your entire history up to a certain point in your autobiography, From Dreamer to Dreamfinder, which I highly recommend everyone read. It's a real blast. And something you mention in there is that there's difficulty in being a Disney nerd back in the day. Why was it so difficult, do you think?
You were alone. I remember when I signed online, it was in the 90s. Got my first personal computer and was amazed to find this huge, the Rec Arts Disney Park site and the online community of Disney fans. We first started to recognize each other and see brothers and sisters all over the world. But back in the 60s and 70s, there were no books to speak of. There were monthly publications from the Disney organization that were basically promotional pieces, like the Disney News and Disney Magazine. But you had to go out on foot to Disneyland. I had to take my little tape recorder with me. I took my Super 8mm film camera, my Instamatic camera, and would take pictures and shoot film and make audio recordings. And I memorized all the ride narrations and everything like that. But you were pretty much on your own if you wanted to be a Disney nerd back then. Now, just about everything that I collected back then is available online. You can download it all for nothing.
I think that's so fascinating because, I've spoken to other people who are big fans, and they tell me about being, in the 80s and going, I took this recorder and, I tried to get Spaceship Earth, or I left it on the side of the ride to get cue sounds, and then I picked it back up when I came back through. And there is this long history, I think, of Disney aficionados who try to sort of bottle up or capture some aspect of the magic so they can take it home, because you don't get to always, unless you live close, go quite frequently.
It's so very true. And now they're even bottling the aroma of the ride. You can buy Pirates of the Caribbean water that smells like the ride. I mean, it's become ludicrous. And as we're speaking right now, there's that massive auction at Van Eaton Galleries in California. One of the largest collectors in the world, Richard Kraft, is auctioning off his collection of ride vehicles. And the amazing thing for me is there's a couple $100,000 worth of stuff he's selling that I used to own in my collection. Not the same ones, but the same kind of publications.
Now let's talk about who might be considered the original Disney nerd, Dave Smith. Who you had the opportunity to befriend and meet. What's your relationship with Dave, and what do you think he was able to do to make all this a little more possible when it comes to our nerdery?
You're talking about my hero there. Dave was not an especially big Disney fan when they found him in 1970, I think it was. He was a librarian at UCLA, studying library sciences at UCLA, when he read that the Disney organization was looking for an archivist. He had done some work on a bibliography about Walt, but he came in kind of through the back door and said, "Look, you're going to need an archivist. Let me try and do this." And so he was turned loose in the company, and with very little other authority, just wandered over the back lot and broke into offices and rifled file cabinets and went around to the different divisions and said, "What have you got? What are you trying to hang on to? I can take the stuff off your hands and take care of it for you." And so, like you say, I met. I was one of the very first people, I think, to visit the Disney archives back when the whole thing was being kept in Walt Disney's suite of offices, which he wasn't using. Hadn't been there for 3 years. It was after he passed. Dave showed me around. He was just a young guy at the time, and I got to handle the animation cells for the first Mickey Mouse cartoons, and I got to see all the costumes from Annette Funicello and Davy Crockett and Zorro, and I got to wander through Walt's offices. And since then, Dave has just been the best friend a Disney fan could have. He's made himself incredibly available to answer questions, and he's at all the events now. Of course, he's the archivist emeritus. He's no longer in the official position, but he's still everywhere that you go. You'll run into Dave Smith, and he's just a good friend to all of us. And I feel a special kinship to him because he knew me when.
Now, you mentioned this in the book, and I think it's also interesting because we've been talking a little bit about inquisitive natures, trying to capture audio, trying to get video, trying to do stuff. And one of the things when you first sort of got into the company as a cast member is in your downtime, your inquisitive nature had you kind of going into places backstage and exploring where maybe not necessarily, I think back then the rules might have been a little different, but it wasn't necessarily where you were supposed to be, but no one was really telling you otherwise anyway. What gave you that drive? I hear a lot of people say that they get into this because they just want to see how the sausage is made, and you really got the opportunity to go backstage and do that. What were some of your favorite places to just go and look from behind the curtain?
Oh, geez. The thing is since there was no Disney fan community back then in the 70s and 80s when I was, especially the 70s when I was sneaking around backstage, that's what it was. There was not the security. Nobody at the Disney organization for many years knew what the feeling was on the 25th anniversary in 1980, when I got hired on at the Golden Horseshoe Review, the company manufactured very limited numbers of commemorative merchandise to the point where on the day of the 25th anniversary, there was none available in the park. It had all been sold in the months prior. The company did not think anybody was going to give a damn. So they had the years that followed the response to the 20th anniversary. Every year, then they were doing anniversaries and giving prizes away and giving cars away, and that's when it started to become. The company became self-aware, and so did all of we. So did all of us. I remember visiting Disneyland on the 25th anniversary. The park was open 24 hours, and everywhere you went in the park, it was just nicely crowded. There was no mob scene. And everywhere you went, every attraction you went on, you were surrounded by people who would not have been anywhere else in the world that day. And it was like family, and it was an amazing feeling. You go back for the 50th anniversary, it's a freaking mob scene. You cannot get into the park without waiting in a 2-hour line that runs off into the adjacent park. And you can't turn around in the park, and it's just a total disaster. And this is, it's grown since then. And in a year or so, we're going to open Galaxy's Edge, and you won't be able to get within driving distance of the park. You're not going to get to see that place for a long time, I'm sure, because of the mobs. But back then, the company didn't know what they had. And one of the manifestations of that was there was no backstage security back then. Now, of course, there are people who are known for sticking around backstage and getting caught and getting tossed off property. But back then, you could just walk backstage. And I was a rather mature-looking 18-year-old when I first started. This is the first time I was hired there. So I kind of went just about everywhere. I snuck in backstage at a lot of the attractions, Submarine Voyage, Primeval World, Haunted Mansion, Pirates of the Caribbean. I went just about everywhere a person could want to go. And I was alone. Nobody was really watching. The security was very, very lax backstage. And in the years since, it has become incredibly tight and inadvisable to try any of the things that I tried.
I'm going to speak on something that, is something that an experience that you had that I don't think anyone's going to be able to have anymore. And this is when you worked at Magic Mountain. And of course, before you got to hang out with a dragon, you had another sort of companion that was just as maybe a little more ferocious, or could be, named Major. Tell us a little bit about Major and the experience with him.
This would be the second year that Magic Mountain was open, our second summer of 72. The park opened a children's animal farm. It was like a petting zoo. It had a big barn, a big open area, water features, and we had your goats, we had your llamas, we had your chickens running around. But we also teamed up with Stuart Raffil of Africa USA, and he lent us his personal pet, whose name Major was a full-grown African lion. And for the summer, we housed him in a barn there. They built this beautiful old shack, looked like it had been there forever. And they had put came up with a character of the Old Man of the Mountain. And I saw a blurb about this in the newspaper. I'd worked the previous summer at Magic Mountain as a ride operator and a spieler. And I saw this little article saying there's going to be an old man of the mountain who's going to tell animal stories to children while surrounded by affection-trained animals. And I went right to Magic Mountain and said, I want that job. And at the time I did this, I had long hair and a beard. And boom, I got because I could talk for a living and I had some theatrical experience, I got the job and found myself suddenly working with this full-grown African lion. Major, at the time I worked with him, they figure he was about 25 years old, which is 125 in lion years. He had all of his teeth. He had all of his claws. He was still very active, and he had been affection trained, so that he really loved people. Not to eat, but I mean, you could go up and pet him, and you could hug him. You didn't want to mess with him. You didn't want to tick him off. And I saw what he could do when he really got upset about things. But I spent the summer in this 110, 115 degree heat out on this porch with Major. Of course, they're nocturnal animals, and he spent a lot of time just kind of laying there dozing off. But we were surrounded by guests. He'd sit up and move around. We'd have our picture taken with the guests. Every so often we'd bring a blind child up on the porch, and they'd touch him, and he'd lay perfectly still. He was a terrific friend, and you could feel every one of those years coming off him. The character. He was very, very warm and affectionate, and we got to be good friends. I was standing with him one day, kind of bent over, and he nipped me on the butt, and I panicked. I went to my boss and said, "Listen, he just bit me on the ass." Frank said, "That's a kiss. Next time you go over to him, put your arm in his mouth." And so I walked over to Major, and I stuck my forearm in his mouth, and he just chewed on it lightly. And sure enough, that was a kiss. And we greeted each other that way every day since. I worked with him through the summer of '72. I went back and visited him in the summer of '73, and he passed shortly thereafter. He was you can see Major in the Disney film Napoleon and Samantha, which was Jodie Foster's first film. He was with Johnny Whitaker and Michael Douglas. And Major, they used two lions in that film. You can tell which one's Major because Major did the less active scenes, and also Major didn't have a tuft on his tail. He lost it in a fight back when he was living in the wild. So when you see a stunt lion has a tuft on his tail, but when there's no tuft, that's my boy.
Now, Magic Mountain and some other work you did, you really get the opportunity to play with crowds and engage with people in a really unique theme park interaction. Is so specific and in many ways niche. I think and we'll talk more about it. It's sort of growing and shifting and evolving now. But what do you wish you would have known about crowd wrangling when you started that you learned later?
Wow. Well, the whole purpose of my getting into this business and deciding that this is what I wanted to do with my life was to find that out, to get that experience. And so what I've done over my 40 years was I took a greater variety of these jobs as I could have. So I worked on the streets, I worked on stages, I worked as a writer and a director. There's really nothing. I mean, the whole thing was a voyage of discovery. I started I've studied stand-up comedy, and you always start off by mimicking what you've seen and what you've liked. So when I had my first spieling job at Magic Mountain in '71, I was stealing material from the Jungle Cruise and from the Golden Horseshoe Review and the Mike Fink Keel boats and all the places that had humor. But I just started just talking, and I had a queue line at Magic Mountain. I was on the Grand Prix, and I had a microphone there, so I had a captive audience of like 150 people waiting for 15 minutes to get on the ride. And I would just start talking, and if they laughed at something, I kept it. And the thing that let me see, that I think the thing that I most remember, the great lesson for me, has been respect. Respecting the audience's intelligence. Not wasting their time. Some of the elements I talk about in my book. If you're going to tell a joke, make it a funny joke. Something that you and the guests find funny. Unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff that passes for humor in theme parks that's just cute, but isn't funny. And guests don't like that. They don't like it. They may groan at a bad joke, but a groan is not a laugh. A laugh is an expression of delight. A groan, like when you're telling puns, is basically an audience saying, "Don't do that again." So what I found is that if I respect the audience's intelligence, do things that entertain myself. If I don't laugh at it myself when I think of it, I know the audience is probably not going to laugh at it when they hear it. So I tend to write for myself and then try the material out on the audience and build on it that way.
So all of this, of course, leads to you having the opportunity to work at the Golden Horseshoe Review at Disneyland. And, of course, not only, work there, but, be, I think it was second understudy, if I remember correctly, to the legendary Wally Boag. Tell us about Wally. What do you think? I mean, for those who are listening and don't know, Wally was, of course, massively influential in the tone set, not only for the Golden Horseshoe, but for Tiki Room, and I believe he even wrote some lines for Haunted Mansion. I mean, he really was a jack of all trades in providing mood and atmosphere, and just really good lines that have lasted forever. What do you think made his impact so important, and what did you learn from him?
Wally was a consummate professional. When he was 16, he was teaching dance. He had his own dance school. And he had already, when he got hired on at Disneyland, he'd already been all over the world doing his act with the balloons, the ventriloquist. He played the bagpipes. He was an eccentric dancer. He'd been all over on the Ed Sullivan Show. He'd been everywhere. And when Walt hired him, Donald Novis, who was the original Irish tenor at the Golden Horseshoe, recommended Wally, and Wally came in and auditioned for Walt and did his Vegas act. It's more of a nightclub act, and Walt said, "No, this is a family park," and Wally said, "No, don't worry, I can clean it up." And Walt loved his sense of humor. And like you say, he used Wally every chance he could. They were very close, and or as close as one could get to Walt. And Wally was called in to work on the Winter Olympics that Walt did, and all the attractions and the movies. He did all the stunt work that Fred McMurray did in Absent-Minded Professor, bouncing up and down in the basketball court. That was all Wally Boag in a Fred McMurray mask. And he did modeling for the animators. He was a living consultant for them. The thing that I learned from Wally, that's easy. Our job in a theme park, whatever you're doing, is to create the miracle of the first time. Keep it fresh. And Wally would do 5 and 10 shows a day of the Golden Horseshoe Review. And I would quite often be there in the audience and watching, and it was always fresh. It was always new to Wally and Fulton and Betty. They were consummate professionals. Everything he did got a laugh, and that's why I became such a fan. And sitting there in the audience watching him growing up, I saw him for the first time where I was conscious in 1970, and made the decision that that's what I want to do with my life. I want to be Wally Boag. What I found out years later was I was not alone. There were 4 or 5 of us through the decades that looked at Wally and said, I want to do that with my life. And many, many years later, we had a dinner tribute to Wally in Anaheim, and I was sitting at the front table with 3 other guys. All of whom had worked at Disneyland, saw Wally Boag, and decided that's what we want to do with our lives, and all wound up understudying Wally. The saddest thing about understudying Wally Boag was that meant you were there when he wasn't. So I didn't get to see him nearly as often as I would have liked, but he and all the people I worked with at the Golden Horseshoe had been there when Walt was there. And they were a different type of people. It was a different kind of time. I was very fortunate to work at Disneyland from 1980 to 1982 when I was working with the people who had worked for Walt, and it was a very different atmosphere on stage and backstage.
Explain that a little bit. I mean, what is the, and of course things have evolved even more now, but what is that environment like? Work ethic, or was it something specific that you really sort of gravitated towards?
It comes back to respect. Respect for the frontline employee, respect for the audience, respect for the story you're telling, and respect for the art form. All 4 of those things are what make for quality work in any capacity, but in a theme park especially because of the intense contact on all levels that you have. I met Ron Miller a couple times. There's no sweeter guy in the world. And even after Walt was gone, you had people like Dick Nunes, who was running the parks until Mr. Eisner moved him out. And you had Carl Walker, Don Tatum, a lot of people who got it and were there because they were there with Walt, and they were carrying that tradition forward. They had I was working as the Dreamfinder when Mr. Eisner came in. They called us in off set. They had a big meeting. And they explained to us that every area of the park was now going to become a profit center. That every section was going to be expected to produce 20% growth. And I had a piece of paper in front of me, and I wrote down Epcot, Eisner's profit center of tomorrow. And I passed that around the table, under the table, and everybody got a good chuckle out of it. Now Eisner, make no mistake, especially during his first 10 years, revolutionized that company, did a lot of wonderful, wonderful things for the company. And there are people there, yes, who are working for the paycheck. They don't last because this is a very challenging business. And if you're there for the paycheck, you're not going to last. You're not going to stick around because you can make more money other places.
Yeah.
The people who are there, in spite of everything, are the people who need to be there, who find it personally rewarding. As I say in my book, it used to be when you got to the park and you went through traditions training back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. They put you through training and they douse you with pixie dust. And that philosophy, they give you that Disney philosophy as a full day of training. They give you that Disney philosophy, and that carries you through. Nowadays, the same day of training covers a lot of legalese and a lot of non-disclosures and a lot of corporate cover your butt. So the people who work there and do it well have to make their own pixie dust. You have to stir it up at home and apply it liberally every morning. And you got to take it to work with you because the pixie dust the company gives you, and they still do try, is kind of cut with milk, sugar, and chalk and flakes off quickly. You have to be there because you personally want to be there and want to do that, want to handle the crowds, want to handle the heat, because the look in a guest's eye when you create that magic moment. And it will be that way for the foreseeable future. There are other places now besides Disney that have caught on to that, and there are generations like myself of people who grew up at Disneyland, remember that, and are now have gone elsewhere and to create that same magic. You go to Renaissance fairs, you see that all the time. People at Renaissance fairs, because there's very little corporate structure in a Renaissance fair. People are out there because they want to be there and they love it, right. And they have a certain benign neglect, so they can get away with things you can't get away with in the corporate theme parks. I've always been fascinated with what you can do in the corporate theme parks within those strictures, because you really have to be creative. You really have to be clever to within that corporate structure to create intimate magic, personal magic for the guest.
Is that structure, that corporate structure you talk about, sometimes people, their creativity flourishes because they have those boundaries. Do you think that's a benefit of that corporate structure, if there is any benefit to it?
Oh, yeah. The boundaries are what make it possible to be truly creative. When you've got creative limitations, you have to be creative. You've only given so much space. You've only been given so much budget. And so the whole idea of themed entertainment is dealing creatively with operational realities. You've got to create, you've got to provide restrooms, and you've got to provide all these physical plants for human beings, and everything's got to be ADA compliant. And so within that real world that you're building, then you're creating magic. I came up with this metaphor, and I'll try this out on you. Is imagine a bubble, a big bright bubble, just glowing. Now, encase that bubble in a huge black metal sphere with vents and doors and piping and signs saying keep off the grass. And inside that black sphere, but outside the bubble, you've got the guests. They're floating in space. And your job is to keep them focused on that bubble so that they don't notice and don't mind the giant black sphere that's holding them. That's what we do in theme parks. We create this huge industrial thing around them, and then we try to trick them into ignoring it and just focus on the story we're telling and lose themselves in that story. And it becomes more and more difficult every day because one of the signs on that big black sphere says parking is $20. And then we've got fast pass lines. Every attraction now has 4 lines to get into the one attraction. And so the waiting takes forever and the prices keep going up and the mobs get bigger because of annual pass holders and all these things. But we try to keep them focused on the story and on the magic. And there lies the challenge.
And I think one of the ways you do that, something you mentioned in your book, which is something you call creating the miracle of the first time, which explain a little bit about what that is, because I think that's very essential to getting them to look at that bubble.
It's something we learn to do in acting, and that you're doing a show with you got a long run, hopefully, and you're doing the same thing night after night at the same time in the same place, and you're portraying a character who has never lived that moment before. So for the actor, you have to be in that moment and living that each moment of discovery. You have to listen to the people who are pretending to talk to you, and you have to spontaneously respond to them. In the theme parks, we're doing the same thing. We are trying to give the guest the illusion that this has never happened before. So now, for example, if I'm portraying a wizard who's walking around with a dragon on his arm, there are only, I'm going to be meeting 600 people an hour, and I'm going to be out there for 6 hours a day. And the fact of the matter is that people have a limited number of ways to respond to any particular stimulus. And they all come from the same place. Everybody comes from the same society, the same environments. And so there's only, say, 7 or 8 different ways that a human being is going to respond to a wizard with a dragon on his arm. So quickly you come out there with a dragon on your arm and you discover these same people saying the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And you want every one of them to come away with the illusion that what they said was the first time you ever heard it, and that you thought it was the most clever thing in the world, and that your response to them has been completely spontaneous and is something that's never happened before. And so one of the things I learned as Dreamfinder was I learned what those 7 or 8 different ways were, and I would ad-lib different responses, and the ones that worked I kept. So I could stand out there for my 30 minutes and meet these people, and by rotating my answers and keeping alert and keeping aware of my environment, I could give each one of these people the illusion that they were the first person ever to meet me. No one had ever had that particular response. And that's the particular skill of the one-on-one performer. When you're creating a stage show, you do everything you can to make it seem spontaneous by keeping your performance fresh. When I would walk up to the stage at the Golden Horseshoe, and Fulton Burley would say, I would say, "You look like $1 million up there." And he'd say, "You've never seen $1 million." And I say, "That's what you look like, something I've never seen before." And we just did it like we'd never done it before. And that's the real skill. That is the real bottom line job of a performer in a theme park. It's not just getting up and delivering the lines, but the skill which you bring to making it look like it's never happened before.
Everything beyond the photo op, which is the sort of the, that's the template. You have to do that part, but you do a lot of exploring in your book about the other aspects. And one of the things that you end up doing later on in your career is you end up over at Universal, and you're directing and supervising all of the celebrity lookalikes at this new Kid on the Block theme park. And these characters were like Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers and Marilyn Monroe and W.C. Fields. And sadly, I think Marilyn's the only one of those I've just mentioned that are still around at the park.
Blues Brothers.
And Blues Brothers,
there.
of course. Yes, of course. And when you took that experience from, the Dreamfinder and all of that, and you had this opportunity to sort of literally start an ethos of what it could be like at Universal for these lookalikes. What did you have in mind? What was your main goal for these performers?
I had been to Universal Studios in Hollywood where they had the characters walking around and they would sign autographs, but they would always sign their own names as well as the character names. And when I got the job in Florida, I determined that we're not about the actor, we're about the character. And this is a tremendous responsibility. You pay good money if you want to portray the Marx Brothers. You have to pay the estate a lot of money. And I had been fans of these characters since I was in high school. I knew every W.C. Fields film by heart, and I'd watched hours and hours of Laurel and Hardy and W.C. Fields and the Marxes. So I told my people, I said, we have inherited a great responsibility. And what I want to do is I want to make these characters live now. I don't want to just recreate what they did, because when you try to recreate something that they did in the past, you only come off looking second best. Whereas if you are in the moment and reacting with the guests and playing that character off against the guest's immediate response, then the character can live. And the guest has not just a moment of, oh, I remember him. It's, oh my God, I met the Marx Brothers. I was insulted by W.C. Fields. And my people got that. I was very, very lucky with a team of talented people. Not everyone was impressionists. Not everyone was looked especially like the character. But I found that more important than looking like the character, the most important thing was to be able to create the illusion within the guest that they'd met the character. So, for example, I had 2 Marilyn Monroes when we opened. Heather didn't look like Marilyn Monroe so much. Lisa looked exactly like Marilyn Monroe. But Heather did a better job of making a guy feel like he was a sexual beast. and that's more valuable when you're looking for a Marilyn Monroe lookalike, is the ability to do that. So I told my people that I wanted them to make these characters live, that I worked with them and watching the films and studying the films and isolating the things, the rhythms and the mindset that these characters had in their films. But then I said, now go out in the world and find the moments that you can make with the guests. So I could walk through the park and I was constantly being surprised by my own people because they took these characters and they ran with them. And again, it was respect for the characters. Respect for the characters we were playing, respect for the audience's intelligence, and then my respect for the performers, that I gave them that creative freedom.
From the outside looking in, it feels like at the time of Universal coming about, Universal had a little bit of a looser vibe, maybe even one might say like the early days of Disneyland, to play, especially for performers that might have sort of been chipped away over time at Disney. Was that the actual vibe going into this fresh new park, or did you feel there was the same amount of constraints as when you worked over at Epcot?
Very different, very loose, and that came from the top. The corporate structure of any one of these companies dictates, for good or bad, the philosophy that you run into in working on the front lines. Walt Disney, when they opened Disneyland, they didn't have a lot of atmosphere entertainment. They didn't even have many, didn't have the walk-around characters at first. Until like 59, I think they started to get the strolling characters in any organized form. Disneyland was was built because Walt wanted one. Universal Studios was built because Walt's got one, so we want one too. And by the time Universal came out here to Florida in 1990, the company was so completely focused on recreating the attractions from California, trying to make them standalone attractions, that the company philosophy going into it, and I had a meeting with them like 2 years before the park opened, there was going to be no entertainment division. They thought that the actors would be handled by by operations. It wasn't until somebody said, well, wait a minute, we need to have animated characters walk around, and we want to have the celebrity lookalikes, so we're going to need to have an entertainment division. And so we were an afterthought, which was good for us because nobody was telling us what to do. They didn't expect my characters to do anything more than they did in Hollywood. Just stroll around and pose for pictures. We were the ones who decided the Blues Brothers are going to have a show, and Laurel and Hardy are going to have a Model A drive around the park, and the Marx Brothers were going to do Shakespeare in the park, and it was this atmosphere of benign neglect that I find is very important for the independent artist to work within these things. That you respect the artist, but at the same time you leave them the hell alone and see what they can come up with, because they're the people who know how to do that, and the corporate people don't always feel that way.
So you end up as a creative writer for Universal, writing shows, and it just seems about anything that they wanted, you'd throw your hat in. Is there something you're most proud of looking back that you wrote?
Oh, I think there's the show we did for the very first Halloween event at Universal Florida. There was a show we did at the Bates Motel where the Blues Brothers checked into the Bates Motel. It started off as a very small show. Beetlejuice was going to do a guided tour of a graveyard out behind the Bates. And every time I would submit a script, my boss, Neil Miller, would look at me and say, that's good, make it bigger. And it wound up being this wonderful big show that just we had ad performances, and the Blues Brothers were amazing, and we had Norman Bates, and we had Beetlejuice, we had a decomposed Elvis came out of a hole in the ground, we had a chainsaw wielding maniac who assaulted the audience, and we had music and special effects, and we got to use the real Bates Motel. And that was a wonderful show, and we kind of pulled that out of thin air. We did that. We did a couple of big events for them. The thing I'm proudest of at Universal was just the evolution of the lookalike program and what I created with those people. And sad to say, I left there in I think '93. And the lookalikes lasted for a while, but then they changed managements, as they often do. And the new management came in and decided that nobody knows who Laurel and Hardy are. So they excised the vast majority of our program. And they still got the Blues Brothers show, but I'm very proud of the Blues Brothers show that I created. But it's been fixed a couple times, the way you fix a dog. And but the difference is that a dog is only fixed once and does limited damage, but they fixed it several times, and it's not the same.
You mentioned how they let characters like Laurel and Hardy go. If they were allowed to continue, do you think they would have still been in the mind's eye of culture a little longer?
Well, it's not the job of the theme parks to keep them alive, but it's the job of the individual performer. I knew there were people in the park who didn't know who Laurel and Hardy were, but here comes this Model A around the corner with the music playing softly in the background, just like they had in the films. And the characters got out and did truly funny bits. They didn't just pose for pictures. They didn't just sign for autographs. They were the living embodiment of Laurel and Hardy, which was, for me, the whole purpose. So that these people, there were people who discovered Laurel and Hardy and became fans of theirs through that experience. It's just the same thing that happened at, or was supposed to happen at Epcot, and did happen for many, many, many years. Epcot was created not as an entertainment park, but as an edutainment park. It was meant to inspire people to look at the world around them and find their place in it. And it did.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the effect that the early 80s Epcot Center had on the guest. And I've met people who were inspired in their life's work, what became their life's work, by the experiences they had in Future World Pavilions or in World Showcase. And the theme park can have that potent effect on people, and that's one of the things that people look for. They go to a theme park, go to Disney instead of going to Six Flags, because they're looking for that emotional connection. I have no doubt a strong case can be made for, let's get rid of Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers. They're no longer current. And instead they had Bill and Ted in there, who are every bit as comedically vital as Laurel and Hardy once were. It doesn't mean that we have to get rid of Laurel and Hardy, but I can see the case for doing that. I mean, whatever resentment I have to them for getting rid of it, it's personal. It's purely personal, and those are people I knew and loved and trained, and they kind of got rid of them coldly. But it's an industry. This is a big business, and I understand that. You look at the changes going on right now at Disneyland. They cut off about half of Frontierland to build the new Star Wars area. Well, it makes perfect sense, because if you look at Disneyland when it was opened in 1955, 2/5 of Disneyland was Frontierland. Why? Because back in the 1955, you had Davy Crockett, you had Zorro, you had Gunsmoke, you had Bonanza. The whole world was going nuts for the Wild West. Not so much now. Now, what's the story? The big stories that are being sold are fantasy and science fiction. So now you're going to have 2/5 of the park is going to be Fantasyland and Galaxy's Edge and Tomorrowland. Makes perfect sense.
No, I find that fascinating, and sort of refreshing, because I feel like a lot of people look at IPs in the parks and they sort of say, like, well, and in many ways it's true, like, they're going to have to get rid of something that is from my childhood, or something that's very special to me, to make these things that will connect to other children happen as well. And I think Epcot especially has been hit and has been a constant sort of fan conversation, about the ever-evolving nature of what Epcot was and what Epcot seems to be going towards. I feel like there's a lot of plans, and we don't really know what a lot of them look like yet. What is your feelings on all of this? Epcot came before the internet and before edutainment became, literally something you can get from your pocket and Wikipedia and all this other stuff. Is there a place for the Epcot Center of today, or is this a natural evolution?
Both, as a matter of fact. You can change anything for the better, or you can just change. Like what they did to Imagination Pavilion. They took the guts out of the story and just tried to put up 4 walls that said, "Wee, it's imagination." Well, the 5 senses don't belong in the Imagination Pavilion, not the way they've done it. But you look at what they did with World of Motion. World of Motion is supposed to be about the future of transportation. It was a trip to the past. Of course, they brought Ward Kimball in to do it, and he did a wonderful job with it. But then they changed it into Test Track, and it was about cars. Not quite the same, but the version they have now is about the future of transportation. And it looks and feels like an experience in Tron's universe, and it's every bit of it feels like an Epcot Center ride of the early 80s. It's futuristic, it's inspiring, it puts you in the middle of it with the design elements. That to me is an absolute Epcot Center 1982 home run. It feels like a real Epcot experience. Living Seas, I don't at all resent them bringing Nemo in, because that's our audience. Our audience is to inspire children and families, and the Nemo element is there, but every bit of the message, the inspiring message of the Living Seas Pavilion, boom, is still there. So I don't know how they're going to make an inspiring and educational experience out of the Guardians of the Galaxy roller coaster. I don't expect they're going to. I don't know. One of the things I insist on whenever I can is I like to remain an audience. I don't judge things until they open. I can listen to the concept. I have a lot of faith in Imagineers, but let's say at the same time, I find that 50% of the time, the stuff that the Imagineers and Disney come up with are wonderful, and they hit it out of the park, and it's great stuff. And 50% of the time, they miss. Let us not forget that the Tower of Terror opened the same day that Food Rocks opened at Epcot Center. So it could go either way. I don't like to prejudge. IPs are just collections of stories. We are in the story business. You can tell the story well, you can tell it poorly. They changed the Tower of Terror in California to Guardians of the Galaxy and made it much, 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 much better. As much as I love the Tower of Terror. So it's up to the artists, and the artists are behind locked, closed doors in Glendale. We don't know what they're doing. We don't know what they know. But they got the jobs, and we're the audience. So I wait until it opens, and then I judge it. And like I say, 50% of the time, I think they're straight on.
Cautiously optimistic is a wonderful. If you can keep that going, that's a great place to be as a Disney fan. I think for things you're not sure of.
It's the only thing that makes sense and isn't irritating to read about on YouTube.
Just to change topics a little bit, I am curious. You've done lots of freelance work once you left Universal, and I'm always sort of fascinated about the world outside of Disney and Universal here in Orlando, and the things that are going on. And I'm curious about the Orlando acting community. Is it tight-knit? Are people always looking towards New York or Hollywood? Is this a stop for some? Is this a life sort of place for others? And of course, for you, it's been several decades now, of course, where you have called home and done your craft. What is that community like in Orlando?
Well, of course, we have an unnaturally large talent pool because of the theme parks. They hire hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very skilled performers. They hold auditions in New York and Atlanta and Miami and California, and they bring people from all over the world here. One of the largest hirings of any talent pool was when we created Epcot Center. They brought people from all over the world to be live performers at Epcot. And so we have this immense talent pool. We have a fairly healthy theatrical community with various groups in the Winter Park Players and Community Theater. The Orlando Shakespeare Festival is a wonderful place. Mad Cow Theater, I still do work for them all the time. And Osceola Arts. There's a whole bunch of theaters here that benefit from the talent. And the theme parks can be very lenient when they want to be and let you sneak off. You do your gig during the day at the parks, and then you can go off at night and do these other shows. So you can see some wonderful theater in town. And it is pretty tight-knit. We know each other pretty well. And some of the places, like the Shakespeare Festival, can be tough to crack because there is so much talent there, and it's kind of be tough to get started in there, but it can be done. I did it. And I'm good. I'm not that good. But it's so there's a lot of stuff here and that, and there's smaller attractions. The smaller attractions hire a lot of talent too. That once you're no longer with Disney and Universal, Sleuths is a wonderful mystery dinner theater show that's been running for I think they're just celebrating their 20th anniversary. And they do amazing work, and we used to have a lot more themed dinner shows. I love themed dinner shows, and I've worked at a couple and created a couple. I particularly love that kind of work. So this is a terrific town for a live performer to make a living. I don't see a lot of people. I've seen some, but I haven't seen a lot of people who come here as a stepping stone to New York. I find the people who come here are coming here because of here. Sometimes Disney will bring them down, and they'll discover that they've got a life here. I know some people who have they base their operations here and do a lot of work here, but then work up and down the East Coast. So you got all kinds of stories.
So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of character performance in the parks. And I think a good way to start this conversation, because it's kind of a broad one, is with digital acting. and it's something that, of course, you had experience in with doing Monsters Incorporated Laugh Floor. What makes, that digital acting is so specific and so, I mean, from the outside, it feels like it's a completely different thing than, face-to-face acting. For you, was it a challenge? Was it a unique circumstance?
It was definitely a challenge for me. I'm an older guy, and at the time I was hired into work there, I was easily the oldest person on the opening crew who were playing on the machine, and it's a big machine. The interface is very sophisticated, and it could be second nature to someone who was used to working with a lot of video games, but I was not. So I was really one of the last people in the group to catch on to that, using that interface to portray a living character. But once I got that, no, it was the same. It was the same thing that I'd been doing. The difference is that I wasn't in the same room with the person I was talking to. I was in another room, but I could see them, I could hear them. I knew what their response could be. I had numerous responses for their response. So it was just this wonderful toy that I got to sit in and work to animate. And the world that Pixar created with the monsters was a particularly fertile ground for that.
So we are seeing lots and lots of changes when it comes to theme park immersion. I think I would probably say this all stems from Harry Potter and Universal sort of lighting probably a fire under Disney a little bit as well for immersion. What do you think the future holds, and what are you excited about when it comes to the next 10 years of theme park performance?
The thing that I'm looking for is more and more performance on the front line, guest contact. Disney's got this program, the Living Character Initiative. Monsters Laugh Floor is part of it. And the various, they're putting audio animatrons out in the park, standalone, independent. A lot of great stuff's going to be happening with Galaxy's Edge with that, with putting the robots out there. But to me, the story the one thing we're missing is that level of live interaction that you get at the Renaissance fairs, where everyone that meets the guest has that theatricality to it. Disney's Living Character Initiative is so focused on the technological. They're working on computer programs that will improvise stories for the guests. Because they're going to have these long, the guests are going to be staying at a Star Wars themed hotel, and they're going to be adjacent to the Star Wars themed area, and they're creating environmental stories for the guests to live, and they're creating computer programs that will govern the guest interaction. Well, I wish this could be people doing this. And eventually it will be. There's this wonderful program called Ghost Town Live going on at Knott's Berry Farm right now, where they have a whole community of actors on the streets of the ghost town at Knott's who are telling the story, and the guests are living characters in that story. I don't know very much about it. I've seen pictures and I've seen some video, but that to me sounds terribly exciting. And so the level of guest interaction that I had with my celebrities at Universal, we can have that on the streets. And in every moment, let's say you're going to create a fantasy land, a land that's themed to fantasy. Well, what is fantasy? Fantasy is a story, any story where an average creature, an average child, an average person is taken out of their normal environment and into a supernatural environment where they face challenges that they're ill-suited for, but they emerge victorious by virtue of their normalcy. That's the story of Alice in Wonderland. That's the story of Peter Pan with the Darling children suddenly finding themselves fighting pirates. That's the story of Pinocchio, who's an average wooden puppet who suddenly finds himself inside of a whale and facing all these terrible dangers so he can become a real boy. Every fantasy story has that in common. Now, when Disneyland opened in 1955 and trying to tell the story about Fantasyland on a limited budget, they created these 2-minute rides that took you through the settings from the films and reminded you of the films. But as far as a personal experience of fantasy, it really didn't come close. Nowadays, there should be a troll standing on that drawbridge as you approach the castle. And when you come up to the troll, he says, if the other side you'd see, you must answer me these questions 3, so that you've got a challenge. And you can interact with that character in such a way that you have a personal experience of fantasy. Now you got a whole land to put these people in. Now, I went on Peter Pan's flight a couple of years ago at the Magic Kingdom, and I'm in my little pirate ship all by myself, and I move up into position to launch off into the ride, and there was a girl sitting at the dispatch console who was the spitting image of Tiger Lily. She wasn't dressed as Tiger Lily, but she had the same dark, exotic looks, and the same long, straight black hair, and I took one look at her and I said, this is great. I'm being sent off into Neverland by Tiger Lily. At Disneyland, they used to have a girl dressed as Alice in Wonderland who dispatched you into the Alice in Wonderland ride. That cost nothing. There was no script, but just that created a theatrical moment, a personal moment for the guest, where they had a contact with the story in a way that you're not going to get with a regular ride operator. And that, to me, resonating with that's the future of this industry, is putting an actor in every position. At the Haunted Mansion, you get some of that. You get the people who greet you at the front door without a smile and a foreboding look. There's a little bit of that here and there. It's going to take a company that trusts their people, that trains their people, that respects their people, and turns them loose on the guest. And that, to me, is the exciting future of this industry.
I want to talk a little bit about you're continuing to act and write since, of course, your book. And recently, you had the opportunity to act in a feature film playing the part of, I guess I should say more of playing a part of an American icon.
Well put.
Tell us a little bit about that project.
Well, I went to see a documentary. A friend of mine worked on a documentary called The Dark Side of Disney. My publisher had written the book, and they made a documentary out of it. And so I was at the screening, and they showed the trailer for an upcoming movie called The Further Adventures of Walt's Frozen Head, which I knew nothing about. And they had the trailer, which showed a bunch of actors, but they did not show Walt. They showed the people carrying this box around, but they didn't dare show Walt's frozen head. And I saw this thing, and I thought, I said, oh my goodness, this could be good. This could be very bad. I don't know, but I wish I'd been a part of it. And a couple months passed, and I got an email in the middle of the night asking me if I'd be interested in auditioning for the role of Walt's frozen head. I laughed myself sick for a couple hours about this. They sent me the script, and I read it, and I was very pleasantly surprised. It's the thing I keep comparing it to is it's like a Frank Capra movie. It's got a message. It's a buddy film, really, about these two guys who are thrown together in very unnatural circumstances. One of them's a decapitated head, and the other one's an hourly employee at the Magic Kingdom. And it's a story about hanging on to things too long and how this affects both their lives. And it's not making fun of Walt Disney. It's not scatological at all. It's not satirical, really. Walt does want to go up and look at the park, and they have those moments are in the script. But that's not what the film's about. It's really a well-told story about these two guys, and one happens to be Walt Disney. I sent them an audition and a video audition based on some of the speeches in the script, and I got the part. So I shaved off my beard and was surprised to see how much I looked like Walt without it. They had a wonderful makeup lady, came out and did a terrific job making me look like I'd been frozen for a while. The amusing thing is that I'm 65 years old now, which is exactly the age Walt was when he passed. And went into a soundstage for a couple days in front of a green screen and filmed the stuff. I've seen a rough cut. The visual effect is startling. It really turned out very well. I've only seen a rough cut of the film. I have not seen the final image. There's a lot of stuff that still needs to be done with it. But I'm going to be very interested to see how it's received. It's a strange thing where I've been acting for over 50 years. I've been working in theme parks for over 40 years, and I've been studying the life of Walt Disney all my life. And to suddenly have the two come together like this was totally unexpected and quite giddy. The film, we finished it up a couple of years ago, and it looks like we're going to be in a couple of film festivals next year, which means now that we've booked those, the film is going to be premiered in Orlando before the end of this year. There's going to be a screening for the people who backed it, and for anyone else who can purchase a ticket, there will be screening, I'm told, around the end of October. Is what it's looking like now. I've been waiting quite a while. A lot of people have been waiting quite a while to see this. But all I can say really is that I'm happy with what I got to do. Our director, Benjamin Lancaster, who you had on the show, was very kind to me. I called him after he cast me and said, listen, I got bad news for you. I'm a writer. So I'm going to want to tweak my dialogue a bit. And he let me add some things. He had some things in there that Walt would say, things that he was known for saying, and I get to tweak those a little bit and put an edge on them, and I found the whole thing very rewarding.
Let me ask you a little bit about playing Walt.
Yeah.
Of course, this is playing Walt at a different stage in his life, to say the least. So you get to play a little bit. How reverent did you want to be? And I asked this question to the director when I got the opportunity to interview him, and I'm curious about your response of how much did you want the character to be Walt Disney, the innovator, the man, the creative force, and how much did you want it to be Uncle Walt from the TV? What was that balance for you?
A lot of Uncle Walt. You can't. There's really not much chance to be the innovator because that's not what the story is. There were a few scenes where he was talking to executives in the company, but those were the kind of relationship that Walt had with executives, which he could be kind of short-tempered with the money men. So there was much more opportunity within the script for the Uncle Walt character. Of course, I came at it with the knowledge and affection that I had for the man going in. I've always thought of Walt as being primarily a Midwestern businessman whose sole drive was that whatever it was he touched, he wanted to make it better. He did this with animation. He did it with live action. He did it with television. He did it with amusement parks. He did it with city planning. Everything he put his hand to, he made it better through his own skills and the skills of the many people he inspired to work with him. Far as my characterization was concerned, yes, I went back and I watched some of the videos and some of the TV shows, but really my greatest inspiration, I got to admit, was Tom Hanks and what Tom did in Saving Mr. Banks. And I didn't try to do very much with the voice, dropped my G's as Walt would, and just tried to be the kind of warm guy that I knew Walt could be, with little flashes of temperament, as I knew he had. But I decided, if Tom Hanks could get away with it as well as he did, and I thought he did a wonderful job, without looking any more like Walt Disney than he did look like Tom Hanks, I thought, why push it? So I had, like I said, a wonderful makeup lady who fixed my hairline, and I always had the strong nose, that was really all I trusted in, was what I trusted in, and from the few people that have seen clips, it's been pretty successful.
Well, that's great to hear, and we're very excited to see that come out. Ron Schneider, thank you so much for being on Dreamfinders. I can't thank you enough.
Oh, Nathan, I had a great time. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of Dreamfinders. I can't thank Ron Schneider enough for being my guest. As we mentioned, Ron has a memoir you should definitely check out. From Dreamer to Dreamfinder can be found on Amazon or through Bamboo Forest Publishing. You can also learn more about his recent performance as Walt at waltsfrozenhead.com. Our podcast artwork is provided by J.P. Tanner. Find his other work at tanwoodcreative.com. This podcast is distributed by WDW News Today, the world leader in Disney Parks news. Read all they have to offer at wdwnt.com. Dreamfinders is hosted and produced by yours truly, Nathan Hartman, who you can follow on Twitter at SomeStuffISaid. Tell your friends about the show, and please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts. It takes like 3 seconds, but means the world. Also, if you or someone you know would make a great guest on this program, feel free to email us at dreamfinders@wdwnt.com. I'm Nathan Hartman, and remember, if we can dream it, then we can do it.